with Brooke, Beth Van Osten, Scott Van Osten's daughter, and most of all of you guys. There's just stuff that we learned looking at their classroom material that we were surprised by, and just began to learn different things. And we've also we went and talked to the board, we talked to the education committee about our thoughts, and there's a lot of people working really hard to give our kids a lot of love and show them what they believe to be the best. And we want to go and discuss things with them that we thought, some areas we thought we could improve in without an idea of a direction we thought they might go. And in doing that, we've learned about a classical curriculum, which is a little different than what we offer. It's the way things used to be done a long time ago. But so we invited a couple of speakers. Melanie Curry, she's an education advocate that's from the area, but she deals with a lot of people in our legislature to try to get some changes made. And Ken Calvert from Hillsdale School, where they have a classical curriculum, and they're just going to share with us some information. I just had learned some of this stuff. I became aware of it a little while ago. Ruthie talked to me about it about a year and a half ago, and then until one of my coworkers mentioned something to me, and I said, well, my wife had talked to me about it. I hadn't. I wish I'd have learned things sooner. And so I just thought if anybody else felt the same way, I wanted you to be. I think there's more changes in our children's education material going to be thrown at them as things continue down the road. And I don't want you a year from now to be surprised when you see something, when you might be able to learn about it now. So with that, let Melanie start. Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much. I want to give you a little bit of a perspective on progressive education and Common Core. So I think most of you are here tonight because you have concerns about Common Core standards and maybe what's in them. They're the K-12 standards for math and English language arts that are define what children are supposed to know and be able to do by every grade. Maybe you're concerned with Common Core aligned assessments that will drive what happens in the classroom. The assessments are really the hammer behind the standards. And right now, Michigan is adopting Common Core aligned standards. Maybe you're concerned with the high stakes assessments too, both in terms of what it means for kids, whether some schools use them to allow children to progress grade to grade, and others fear that what happens at high school when you take the assessment in preparation to go to college or when it's doing the ACT. Maybe you're worried about how those high stakes tests will impact teachers, because there's a lot of pressure to begin evaluating teachers and their performance based on how kids perform on these assessments. And if the assessments are not proven and valid and valuable to students, that could have a pretty negative effect on kids. Maybe you're concerned with the emphasis on gap. I don't know if you've heard this term. The gap analysis is what the state is using to judge a lot of schools, and that is the distance between your high-performing students' scores and your lowest-performing students' scores. And a school is graded on how big that distance is. And when I was on the Portage School Board, I asked the question. I said, well, of course, I'm a math person. You come at this, you said, you can close that gap 3 ways. You could bring the bottom kids up, you could bring everybody to the middle, you could just worry about bringing the top kids down. But that's the problem. There is no balancing piece to this measure, gap, that encourages what I would consider the right answer, bringing the bottom kids up. Because you would never want to hinder the performance and learning opportunity of your high-achieving students. But this gap is really driven to create an equity in outcome for kids, not an equity of opportunity. And perhaps you're worried that our political and business leaders now are really promoting the fact that they believe the purpose of K-12 education is to prepare kids for the workforce. And although I'm sure we all want our children to be employable, it was not our intent that their entire K-12 career was to design their minds around a job. Because we all know the jobs now will not be the jobs later, and little kids don't know what they want to do. Sometimes 20-year-olds don't know what they want to do. So all of these concerns are legitimate, but they are the effects of progressive education. The specifics of Common Core that I'm going to cover that have influence over curriculum are just one phase, so to speak, of progressive education. Progressive education, just like all progressive thinking, advocates that as times change, so education should change. So you see this constant turmoil and turnover of educational ideas. Some of you might remember, some of the older members of the group, when they first introduced whole language for learning. Whole language was this brilliant new idea of a way to teach kids how to read. And they actually threw out phonics and prohibited teachers from using phonics as a way to teach kids to read. So that was an early phase of progressive. Think through the ages, through all time about education. Children learned what about their society through the adults who cared for them. Their great insights and stories about your culture passed from generation to generation, even before people could write things down. That's how kids knew what your culture was, what the norms were, what is good, what is bad, what behavior is expected and what's not. I have an example from the writing based on evidence in Common Core standards. So that is a standard in Common Core that you write based on evidence. So you're taking a reading snippet and you are to make conclusions about it and write a response paragraph. And the problem is that if you think about it, in order to grade this well, you have to take all your evidence from what is presented. So students are not permitted to bring in thinking that they might have learned from another source. So here's an example that we got. This was from New York, who had early assessments. By the early 21st century, people knew that the massive use of fossil fuels was heating up the planet. But people didn't stop their destructive lifestyles. They kept on using the Earth's resources, the ice sheets melted, the Earth's crust shifted. So now, in 2130, the oceans began to rise over the farmland and cities. In 300 years, most of the eastern United States was covered with water. Now this is a future projection of something that has not happened, so it's not teaching evidence and facts, but it says, after reading that text, the students were to answer the question and write about what caused all the problems on the earth and how could it have been avoided. And this they have to pull from the source of the reading. So this is part of the problem. This is just one example of how there is teaching about your culture and your history in the Common Core materials that do not align with what we as a country, we as a people, we as a community might believe. I have another example in the new AP History. Now, some people think that since the standards are only English language, arts, and math, that they have nothing to do with science and history. Now, the example I just gave you, one might argue, had something to do with science. I think it has to do with fiction, but just my opinion. But there is a standard called Reading Across the Curriculum. And so what it includes then are references to history and science, and it's built right in the current Common Core standards. These standards lead to the new AP History course. I don't know if you're teaching the AP History course, but you might be interested in looking at the framework for that course. The argument is the framework does not eliminate good teaching of history, but the AP test only tests that which is in the framework. So a teacher, again, being judged on a high-stakes test, and AP tests now are becoming high stakes because obviously they're the source that kids get credit for college. I see we use these in lots of schools for a measure of our own performance, how many kids take AP classes, how many kids get good grades. This is from a teacher of AP History. She says, the framework begins with an anti-Anglo-Saxon colonial basis. On page 36 of the framework, we read under Key Concept 2.1 of the strong belief in British racial and cultural superiority, which caused the British system to embrace slavery. So this, again, is a really good example of how the story behind your culture of your country is being controlled not by your beliefs, but by someone else's beliefs who wants to rewrite history so that children have this perspective that they want them to learn. I have a book from Dr. Terrence Moore. He's a professor at Hillsdale College. He's currently headmaster of a K-12 public classical academy in Atlanta, Georgia. It's called The Story Killers. And the essence of his book is exactly what I'm talking about. That the children do not learn the stories of our culture in the framework and structure of Common Core standards. The children don't read great literature. There is an opportunity, if you read the standards, for great literature to be included, but it's bits and pieces. It's not whole texts. And so for example, in the early grades, it's a deeper reading. So they'll read the same paragraph or page or two 10 times to do this deeper reading and deeper understanding of that section. But they don't read the whole story. So they don't understand the context of the whole story. This is really important. And then children do not know America's history from the passing of great literature, the stories from our own culture. So think too about how children were educated in long term from the beginning, okay? Aristotle's father was a doctor, likely spurred his interest in the natural life, and Aristotle studied under Plato, a parent and a teacher. Jesus, raised in a loving home with Mary and Jesus, but he was educated, or some might say he educated, the rabbis in his synagogue. Again, teacher, parents working together. Helen Keller was raised in a loving home, but her parents realized they needed help. They hired Annie Sullivan, who we remember taught Helen how to communicate with sign language. Again, parents, loving home, teacher. We've now reached a point where parents are no longer considered a valuable part of the teaching picture. The education experts are deciding how and what our children learn, ignoring the concerns and preferences of parents. NBC host Melissa Harris Perry, in case you hadn't heard, was recently quoted that children do not belong to their parents. They belong to society. Our own Governor Snyder and Lieutenant Governor Brian Calley speak of a P20 system. If you haven't heard the buzzword, you might wonder, what does P stand for? Some of us used to think it was preschool. It's not. Lieutenant Governor Calley was recently quoted as saying prenatal. And if you think that was a joke, one European country just passed a new law that assigns a government employee to every child 7 months in utero. And that person is to follow the child through their life and guide the parents, so to speak. And they're offering us free, earlier education, earlier opportunities to send your kids to government-run preschool and daycare. So let's look at Common Core math through this lens. I believe one of the subtle messages is an intentional split between parents and children. Think about if you know how to multiply, for example. They're teaching children primarily not just the standard algorithm, but the assessments require children to learn at least 2 other methods to multiply. And what we've seen in these Common Core aligned assessments is the problems, instead of 20 multiplication problems, and if they get 18 of them right, they pass, they have 10, so it's fewer multiplication problems. They solve each one 3 ways and write a paragraph. And from the other states that are further ahead of us, showing that the scoring is, if a child solves the problem 3 ways and writes the paragraph and gets the wrong answer, they are considered proficient in multiplication. If the child solves the problem using 1 standard algorithm and gets the right answer, they are considered not proficient in multiplication. So you see, again, even if your school wants to teach the primary method, the standard algorithm, the assessment is a key hammer and the standards call for that. It was really funny, Michael Cohen from Achieve came to testify in Lansing, and one of the legislators, Andy Shore, said to him, he said, I am college educated, and my 2 daughters are in elementary school, and they bring math homework home, and they ask for help, and I can't help them. Is that acceptable to you? And Michael Cohen said, well, sometimes kids need tutors for math. And the representative, to his credit, said, you do recall I just said I am college educated and my daughters are in elementary school. And he said, the standards were not written with parents in mind. And if you read Terrence Moore's book, he has some really good examples out of the literature standards that show how anybody who does not know the education lingo is lost in what the standard is attempting to do. And one more math example is geometry, high school geometry. We all learned Euclidean geometry. You might not even remember that word because typically they didn't use it because it was the only way geometry was taught. Well, there was a Russian mathematician who invented transformational geometry. And if you read his original intent, it was for children who were really gifted in geometry to go on and study from different perspectives to really broaden them. It is now the primary method of teaching geometry based on Common Core standards. So when people challenge you and say Common Core standards are not curriculum, use that example because you have to turn your entire delivery of geometry around to meet that standard. Some people believe cursive writing has been eliminated from schools so that kids won't be able to read our original founding documents. I don't know if that's true, but I do know that most schools don't teach cursive writing anymore. And it's even though it's been shown not only to be a good skill, but it develops your brain at appropriate times in your education. Our founding fathers believed that the purpose of education was to develop children as a uniquely critical key to our success of our government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Our government derives its power from our consent. The success of our country depends on our informed consent. Informed consent comes from really understanding. This is one of my favorite examples. I actually learned it through the Hillsdale College Constitution 101 course. And that is to understand the nature of man. This is the very essence of the difference between a classical thought and a progressive thought. Progressive thought says things change. We reinterpret our Constitution because now we have computers. Okay? Technology will always change. That's not what's important. Our Constitution was written based on the nature of man, that we will love, we will hate, we will cheat, we will seek power. It's just part of us. And the way we teach children that truth is through reading great work, great literature over time. So you start with the Bible, and you see those behaviors of love and hate and greed and all of those things, caring. And then you read Shakespeare, and you see the same thing in a completely different period of time. And then you read The Grapes of Wrath, and you see the same thing in another completely different time. Because the nature of man does not change. There is no progressiveness about the nature of man. And it's really important for our children to understand this. And it's very difficult to just pour it onto them, or even just talk about it on Sunday. I mean, kids have to have this as part of how they live. And then I got in a debate with a teacher just recently, and she said, well, you understand we can't talk about religion in school. And I said, here's my problem. If you can't talk about God, for example, where do you teach our children their rights come from? And she didn't have an answer. I also asked her, this is a public school teacher, if all the Catholic and Christian kids in your schools quit going there, how long do you think the public schools would be in business? Right? So we have to have a school system that accepts and does not diss our religious beliefs, but importantly, that brings that national belief that our rights come from God. And I don't know what atheists believe where their rights come from, but if they think they come from government, they're in trouble. So let me just finish with a quote from Thomas Jefferson. This was in 1820. "I know no safe depository for the ultimate powers of society but the people themselves. And if we think them not enlightened enough to exercise their control with wholesome discretion, the remedy is not to take it away from them, but to inform them, and to inform their discretion by education. This is the true corrective of abuses of constitutional power." Thank you.
Thank you, Melanie. Well done. It's great to be here, and just to let you know, if some of the material says this, I'm Kent Calvert. I'm a professor of ancient history at Hillsdale College. I'm also the principal, or we call it headmaster, of the K through 12 school, Hillsdale Academy. We assist hundreds of private schools across the country. Currently, I'm working with 26 different private schools. We also have a group in the Barney Charter School Initiative that works with charter schools across the country. So as I stand before you and make this presentation to you, I want you to keep in mind that I'm very much in the trenches, in the practical application of education. Because as I say what I'm about to say, you might think, how in the world do we do that? All right? But I'm here to challenge you. I'm here to make you think about the quality of education you have now, and what I would like you to do is compare that to the quality of education that was present in this country 200 years ago. We all think, oh, well, we're much more intelligent. We have progressed since that time. But honestly, ladies and gentlemen, if you compare the education, the quality of education that we're giving our children now to what was going on in the 1700s and the early 1800s, we are sorely lacking. We have watered it down to the point where, honestly, our children and honestly, the generations in which are represented here to a great extent, we are a far shadow of what the reality was then. Think of this. In the 1850s, the Lincoln-Douglas debates. How many of you have heard of that, right? Lincoln-Douglas debates leading up to the Civil War. This is when Lincoln and Douglas are debating in Illinois whether or not slavery is constitutional. This is a complex set of debates about a constitutional question, including constitutional argument of the founders, the Federalist Papers, all kinds of things brought in and reported in the newspapers in Illinois. You might think, well, these lectures, these debates took place at colleges and universities all over Illinois, right? Because that's where people would understand these debates. No. These were farmers. These were farming communities. Sitting, listening, understanding hours worth of debate regarding constitutional right or wrong of slavery. Today we think, oh, well, farmers, they're not going to want that kind of education now. Well, I live in a rural county, Hillsdale, Michigan, one of the poorest counties in the state. We've got farmers, construction workers, small industry people who come to our school, and we hold the bar very high. And you know what? If you hold the bar high, and you have high expectations, they will seek to meet them. Quite often, frankly, it's not the students that are our greatest trouble. It's the moms and dads. Oh, they can't possibly do this. Why would you say that about your child, by the way? Why would you say that? Of course they can do it, because they are going to do it. All right? That's what moms and dads are supposed to do. How many of you have heard of the Northwest Ordinance of 1787? Raise your hand. Okay, 4 or 5 people. I'm going to read from the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. This is Article 3, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. By the way, this is considered the third most important document in American history. The first one being the Declaration of Independence. The second one, following closely upon it, the Constitution of the United States. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 established states, let's see, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan. We're Michiganders. Every one of us should know the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. This is what Article 3 states, ladies and gentlemen. Religion, morality, and knowledge, being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. What is to be taught in schools? Religion, morality, and knowledge. In Hillsdale County, and we're Hillsdale, we don't take any federal or state money, I think we're the only school that actually obeys federal law. How many schools do you know of that teach religion, morality, and knowledge? Being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind. And it says schools shall forever be encouraged. They did not, the founding fathers, say, we're going to establish the schools, we're going to tell you what to teach, we're going to give you the curriculum. Forever encouraged. And you might say, well, you know, we've improved on K through 12 education. We're so much better now. You know, there's so much more to learn. We've done it better. Well, let's take a look, shall we, at what was required in colleges and universities in the 1700s, 1600s, 1700s, and 1800s. Okay? Are you ready for this? Because if any of you have gone to college recently, including myself, you would never be accepted into the colleges and universities of the 17th, 18th, and 18th and 19th centuries. Okay, so let's take a look at this. This is from Harvard University, from its founding. This is from Harvard University. Everyone shall consider the main end of his life and studies to know God and Jesus Christ, which is eternal life. That's Harvard University. Everyone shall consider the main end of his life and his studies to know God and Jesus Christ, which is eternal life. Every scholar that on proof is found able to read the original of the Old and New Testament and to resolve them logically with all being of honest life and conversation, and at any public act hath approbation of the overseers and master of the college, may be invested with his first degree. If you can read Hebrew and Greek and Latin, you may graduate. Every scholar that gives up in writing a synopsis or summa of logic, natural and moral philosophy, arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy, and is ready to defend his thesis or positions withal skilled in the originals as aforesaid, and still continues honest and studious at any public act after trial, shall be capable of a second degree of Master of Arts. Now, this is the level of expectation for undergraduates and master's degrees. What, I ask you, must they have been teaching and expecting of students K through 12? I can tell you that it wasn't sitting around and filling in, boxes and playing games and doing group projects. That's not what it was about. It was about heavy-duty education in the classroom by learned teachers. That's what education was about. Here is from Yale University of 1745. None may expect to be admitted into this college unless upon examination, the presidents and tutors, they shall be found to able to read extempore, construe and parse Tully, Virgil, and the Greek New Testament, and to write true Latin prose and to understand the rules of prosodia, of writing, and common arithmetic, and shall bring sufficient testimony of his blameless and inoffensive life. This was expected of entrance into Yale University. And by the way, there were people entering into Yale at 15 and 16 years old in those days. Have we really progressed that far? Have we really come to a point where we are educating our children better than they were in the 18th and 19th centuries? No. We have watered it down. We have continued to dumb it down. I'll get back to that. College of New Jersey, which is now called Princeton University, 1754. By the way, James Madison, okay, Witherspoon, trained presidents, congressmen, senators, chief justices at Princeton, preparing them for true government, for good government in the Republic in those early years. Nothing has a more direct tendency to advance the happiness and glory of a community than the founding of public schools and seminaries of learning for the education of youth and adorning their minds. Listen to that. Adorning their minds. Isn't that a great phrase? With useful knowledge and with virtue. Hereby the rude and ignorant are civilized and rendered humane. The rude and ignorant, they are made humane. Persons who would otherwise be useless members of society are qualified to sustain with honor the offices they may be invested with, for the public service, reverence of the deity, filial piety, and obedience to the laws, all inculcated and promoted by the college. This is the kind of high-minded language with which they approached education. Have you ever seen National Treasury? They open up the Declaration of Independence and they begin to read, and they can read the cursive. And they ask the question, why doesn't everybody talk this way? And there's a reason why they don't talk this way. It's because we're not given the verbiage, the language, the ideas, the constructs to be able to think and to talk this way. Understand something, and Melanie made reference to this, that our founding fathers, who said that religion, morality, and knowledge, is the same men who wrote the Constitution of the United States, so that these things are necessary to good government and the happiness of people. That these people had in mind a certain kind of citizen, a citizen who was well educated, a citizen who was virtuous, a citizen who was wise, intelligent to govern themselves, intelligent enough to govern their families, their communities, and to govern the government. And there is nothing that progressives want more than to make us more ignorant. And I can tell you, you can see this in Marx and Engels. You can see it in the writings of the communists and the socialists, the progressives who govern, who invented progressivism. That to water down the minds, the knowledge, the education of the population makes them more controllable. And this is something we must be very wary of. So, I will have parents come to me at Hillsdale Academy and they'll say, Dr. Calvert, it's too hard. My daughter doesn't have a life.
Boo-hoo.
Exactly. It's the wrong thing to say in my office. My response to them is this, and I want you to think about this. What do you want for your daughter? Parents. So they can't watch their TV show, they can't play their video games, They can't tell someone they hate them on Facebook. If you're reading Moses and St. Luke and St. Paul, Euclid, if you're reading Shakespeare, Tacitus and Livy, ladies and gentlemen, that is a life. And if they are up until 1 in the morning, I'm not happy about that. It should only be till, 12:15. But, the thing is this. If they are reading deeply in these things and coming to struggle and learn them, that is a life. It may not be the life that Joey or Susie has down the street, but poor Joey and Susie, not your daughter, not your son, they're blessed to have the kind of education to which our founders aspired and to which the citizens, the original citizens of this nation aspired. We must do this if we are to continue to be a free country. We must. And what blows my mind is how so many people who used to do this, 50 years ago this was common. My father grew up in a mountain school, public schools in Altoona, Pennsylvania. And he tells me, Ken, what you do at Hillsdale Academy is wimpy. He learned his way, educated his way through the Great Depression, lived on a dirt farm. Went and fought the Nazis, beat them single-handedly. Came back and became a chemical engineer. He was offered a position at MIT. Eventually took up his studies at Penn State. And this wasn't out of government control. Not at all. This wasn't out of progressive education. It was because his teachers knew what they were talking about in the mountain schools of Pennsylvania. Here's a shocker. None of the teachers at Hillsdale Academy are certified. And the school is not accredited. University of Michigan, Notre Dame University, Harvard, Princeton, Stanford, Chicago, none of them care. And none of them ask why. We take farmers' kids, construction kids, small industry kids, and we teach them well. And they sweat and they cry and sometimes they even bleed through the whole thing. And you know what? That's what these universities want. They don't give two hoots about whether or not one of our teachers got a rubber stamp from the state of Michigan. Ladies and gentlemen, it is time. It is time. Not to meet state standards, but to exceed them times 10.